on it. Feels strange sitting behind. Good evening. It feels a bit strange to give a formal talk. It'd be, I think, more interesting to have a conversation. But what I'll do is I'll just give a sense of a beginning of the project that I was going to talk about, and give a sense of how that project continues, what kinds of questions are raised by the project. And then I think Brian will give a sense of what kinds of issues are raised in his book, 99 Theses, and then we can have some time to talk between us about the question of value, which has been so central to our thinking. Does that work for you, Brian? Okay. So I've just finished a book, or almost finished a book called For a Pragmatics of the Useless. And the piece from which I'll read a little bit is the first chapter in the book, which is also called For a Pragmatics of the Useless, or the Value of the Infrathin. I'll begin there and develop the idea of the infrathin, and then see if I can pull out some of the concepts that are most at stake in the work. All right. 1. The most minute of intervals. Marcel Duchamp describes the infrathin, inframince, as, quote, the most minute of intervals, or the slightest of differences. The concept, Duchamp suggests, cannot be properly defined. Quote, one can only give examples of it. Notes in Duchamp's collection offer a few suggestions. Quote, the warmth of a seat, which has just been left, is infrathin. Quote, subway gates, the people who go through at the very last moment, infrathin. Quote, velvet trousers, their whistling sound in walking by, brushing of the two legs is an infrathin separation signaled by a sound. It is not an infrathin sound. Quote, difference between the contact of water and that of molten lead, for example, or of cream with the walls of its own container moved around the liquid. This difference between two contacts is infrathin. Duchamp's notes are attempts at touching what remains elusive, a quality in the between, an interval that cannot quite be articulated. It's not the seat that is at stake, or even the warmth in, quote, the warmth of a seat which has just been left, but what is left behind. Not the seat, but a quality of leftness. Not the velvet trousers or even the leg, in, quote, their whistling sound in walking by, but the way the rubbing creates a quality of a whistling. Not the substances exactly in, quote, the difference between the contact of water and that of molten lead, but the quality of their interrelation. The infrathin, the potentiation of a relational field that includes what cannot quite be articulated, but nevertheless can be felt. Infrathin, the thisness, the hexaity of an experience that cannot be reduced to the sum of its parts. 2. The exemplary. In the absence of a definition, what is foregrounded is the singularity of experience and the specificity of the example. The infrathin cannot be generalized across experience. It is what makes experience singularly what it is here, now. Between the event and the account of its retelling, an infrathin resides that will never quite be captured. Quote, while trying to place one plane surface precisely on another plane surface, you pass through some infrathin moments. Beyond capture, the infrathin is a grasping at the singularity of an interval too thin to define as such, and yet thick with the texture of lived relation. 3. Prehension. Prehension is the grasping toward through which experience makes itself felt. The event, or the actual occasion in Whitehead's terms, is pulled into experience, its force of actuation tied to what Whitehead calls the data of the occasion. These data are not objects or substances, but relational fields in the parsing. But what of the share of the grasping that cannot quite be parsed, pulled into actuality, that continues to field? What of that which cannot quite be captured, yet makes a difference in the event? What of the share that cannot quite define itself, and yet takes part in how the world is felt? How to articulate the prehension of the infrathin of experience in the making? Whitehead has a concept for that which is not actualized, but nonetheless affects experience. He calls it negative prehension. Negative prehension is what must be actively excluded in order for the event to have consistency. To achieve consistency, there must be elimination. What cannot conform to the color of this singular experience must be backgrounded in order that this experience be fully what it is. Elimination is still participation, however. Excluded by necessity from what is foregrounded, negative prehension nonetheless lurks on the edge of appearance, in the way all backgrounds do. It is not actualized as such in the event, but the event cannot but be infused by it. Every prehension, to a degree, encompasses what negative prehension has textured in. What the infrathin makes palpable is that there is no occasion that does not, to some degree, pull the background into the foreground. The infrathin makes felt the tenuous quality of this both and. The shift from sitting to standing that leaves something behind, a quality ungraspable yet felt, takes the background welter and moves it into the interval of lived experience, infrathin. The infrathin actively backgrounds what is perceived in order to foreground what is not quite within the register of the perceptible. The infrathin foregrounds this ungraspability in the grasping, affirming the withness of experience in the background, foregrounding. In doing so, the infrathin directly prehends the potential of the more than. 4. Subjective form. In a philosophy of process, what is most important is movement, or change. In order for change to happen, however, there must be a moment when the occasion has become absolutely what it is. For without this absoluteness, there would be no difference between this and that. No, quote, elbow room in the universe. Subjective form is the signature of this singular occasion. It is what has now emerged as the subject of the occasion, a subject born of the process. In and of itself, this subject cannot change. In the context of this singular iteration, it will always have been what it now has become. And yet, as Whitehead emphasizes throughout, this actuation of the it is brief, always on the edge of perishing, where the force and not the form-taking as such will be what contributes to future parsings. If what a subjective form does is mark this threshold between force and form, the active schism between what is and what comes to be, the operative question is to what extent the unactualized makes a difference in the passage from force to form, and to what degree this share of the unactualized can alter future comings to form. This is where negative prehension comes in. Despite their not being included in the actual constellation of an event's coming to be this or that, negative prehensions have subjective form. So what I'm trying to do here is to foreground the manner in which what comes to expression as actual, what is experienced as such, carries this quality of excess, this quality that is, in the Deleuzian vocabulary, virtual, how it carries with it, and shifts the conditions of value. Right? So the project here is to begin to understand what it is that this concept of the infrathin, that is a concept that I think pretty much all the scholars of Marcel Duchamp seem to have not foregrounded in the work that they've done on the ready-made. What this work of the infrathin might do to our account of what counts. This is connected to work that I've done for many years in relation to what I call autistic perception. And autistic perception is what I've come to name the quality of perception that is devalued in autistic experience. When autistics talk about how they perceive the world, they make it really clear that that what is valued in a more normative account of perception are the subjects and objects of experience, so the humans and the objects. But they explain, through all of their various writings, how when they come to perception, what is foregrounded for them for quite a remarkable period, as much as 5 minutes, is not the subject or the object fully formed, but a quality of an experience or an event coming into itself. So I've talked about autistic perception as the limit case of all perception. We know, neurologically speaking, that none of us perceive categories. None of us perceive, for example, the human face as we've come to understand its composition. It's an active composition that happens in perception that gives us the symmetries we're familiar with and that we call, for example, human faces. So if we take the autistic example as an example of an account of experience in forming, and we also take with that the recognition that that kind of perception is devalued to an extraordinary degree, then we begin to have an account, or at least this is what I'm proposing, then we begin to have an account of what is devalued in perception but nonetheless makes a difference. This account of value is really at the core of the project that I'm calling for Pragmatics of the Useless, which could be misunderstood as a project that accepts the concept of the useless as a given, which is exactly not what the project is doing. What the project is doing is saying, what if we took on the question of value from the perspective of it not yet having been established? What if we asked of value that it register that which is usually not registered in an account of existence? So here I'll just read a few sentences on the Whiteheadian. So this is a very close reading of Whitehead. And part of the reason that I'm speaking to it is that I'm aware that a very close philosophical reading in a foreign language can sometimes feel like a burden. But just a few words on Whitehead. So in the Whiteheadian philosophy, an occasion of experience is never valued in advance of its coming to be. And the occasion of experience in Whitehead is very close to the concept of the event in Deleuze and Guattari. There is no inherent value to experience, nor is there a hierarchy of value. The human and the non-human, consciousness and the non-conscious, are equally taken into account in this philosophy that refers to the body as a society of molecules. The question is not, quote, what has inherent value, but what are the conditions under which a shift in register expresses itself, and how does this alter lived experience? So what's important in the Whiteheadian cosmology is that he refuses to take experience as primarily human. He refuses to begin in his account of how experience registers as experience to foreground human experience. He takes all kinds of experience as producing shifts and resonances and effects in the world. From this, what is called, certainly what Brian and I call speculative pragmatism, so a philosophy that is absolutely concerned with how things come into expression, but is also equally concerned with what is in excess or what is carried in excess by that coming into itself. The question of elimination or the question of negative prehension seems to me very, very important. If it's not clear, just to repeat that what is unusual in Whitehead's account of negative prehension is this recognition in Whitehead that what does not register nonetheless has value. So this is his philosophical proposition. So again, a few words. To begin with elimination is to foreground what makes a difference in experience despite its exclusion from actualization. If, as is usually the case, the actual is the measure of use value, it would follow that what is not actually included in an occasion has no value. For this unactualized share is not only indiscernible as such, it is unmeasurable even after the fact. Yet it is this very ineffability at the heart of the occasion that gives experience its value, I want to suggest. The value of this speculative share of experience is in its coloring of the event, in its making felt how else experience can be ascertained beyond definition. This would be the first proposition for a pragmatics of the useless. When experience connects to the infrathin, what it is affirming is another way of thinking value. Beyond use value, the valuation not of what is given, but the capacity of transvaluation to perform a shift at the very heart of the process's incompletion, of the process's inherent indeterminacy. In Nietzschean fashion, value here derives from the inact of the process's own affirmation of its difference. To quote Deleuze, creation takes the place of knowledge itself, and affirmation takes the place of all negations. A pragmatics of the useless celebrates the share of experience that is affirmed, not because of what it is, but because of how it affects experience in the making. A pragmatics of the useless is pragmatic in the sense that it is wholly concerned with the how of the events coming to be, this instance of the infrathin, these conditions for activating this interval of experience. The event cannot be generalized across iterations. It is always exemplary, always speculatively pragmatic. A pragmatics of the useless is speculative in the sense that it is open to the transformation to its transformation by the potentializing force of what courses through the event, even when it cannot be fully actualized. Potential courses through the just like this nature of the event, making it reverberate. The infrathin is felt in this reverberation, potentially singularizing. So this thinking of how value is created, which I go through in a lot of detail in this piece, and the piece is actually available, and you can read it. I'd be happy to share it. Is at the heart of a project that I'm thinking of in relation to what I call an approximation of proximity. And what I'm trying to think through the project is how to articulate a question that it was asked by to me by a thinker called Fred Moten, who's a preeminent African-American poet and theorist, that came to me in the final stages of the publication of my last book, The Minor Gesture. Fred was one of the manuscript reviewers of the book, and in the book, The Minor Gesture, I had my proposition was to try to think about neurotypicality as a logic of a certain understanding of value. So the proposal for that book was that neurotypicality, which is to say a certain accepted organization of knowledge and movement, body movement, is so fundamental to how we think that we don't need to name it. The examples are infinite for neurotypicality, but I'll just give a few of them. In Europe, Down syndrome, I don't know what it is in Spanish, is almost now completely non-existent. So the abortion rate for Down syndrome is 99.8%. And yet, if you look at the accounts of quality of life of people with Down syndrome, you'll find that they're extremely high. In fact, they're higher than those without Down syndrome. And if you look at for example, the capacity to learn of people with Down syndrome, you'll find that they excel as visual learners above children without Down syndrome, right? So you have an example here of a kind of euthanasia, a kind of cultural, global acceptance of what we understand life value to entail. That is so accepted that probably there's part of all of us that is thinking, yeah, but really, I mean, come on, Erin. You know, we could have Down syndrome child, it's really hard, and all those things that we've been taught to think. But that's just one case of neurotypicality. You could say that every aspect, globally speaking, of the university system that organizes evaluation is based on neurotypicality, on ways of understanding, but even more so perhaps on ways of recognizing knowledge, right? And what I'm so that was the project in brief of the Minor Gesture, was to think about how the minor challenges these ways of thinking the neurotypical. But when it was published, like I said, or before it was published, Fred Moten said to me, or he wrote in his manuscript review, that he thought that all Black life was neurodiverse life. And when I received that comment, I just thought, oh my goodness, I need years to understand this statement. I mean, I can't include this statement in the book. This is too hard for me to understand. Because what Fred obviously didn't mean was that all black people are autistic, or that all black people have ADHD, or are, that's obviously not what he meant. What he meant, I think, was that the quality of value, or the valuation around neurotypicality has always been a racialized valuation. And so when we speak of neurotypicality, we always also speak of whiteness. And so for the Pragmatics of the Useless is a book that takes this really, really seriously, to ask how value is articulated, first philosophically, how we might think of negative prehension as a way of orienting us toward a language of what else occasions of experience are made of, and how they mobilize other forms of value. In that particular piece, I'm trying to think very seriously about the limitations also of art in relation to organizing itself around the concept of value and markets of value, and how to think about what I've called the artful or other forces that move through experience that don't get captured by those forms of value. But I'm also thinking about the question of race and how modalities of expression that are organized around neurotypicality exclude forms of life that are not registered within the predominant forms of valuation that we might call whiteness or neurotypicality. And following the work of Fred Moten and many other primarily African-American thinkers, I'm trying to reach a systemic thinking. So a thinking at the level of logics rather than individual bodies. And the reason I'm trying to do that is because what is really interesting to me about Fred Moten's concept of black life is that he's trying to think about forms of life, forms of sociality, forms of political life, which have been produced, no doubt, through the history of slavery in relation to forms of value and value exclusion, but can't be limited to epidermal accounts of race. So in this book, the logic that I was talking about, the approximation of proximity, tries to understand a statement like black life is neurodiverse life, or black life was never neurotypical life, and understand a logic that isn't one of collapsing one mode of life onto another, but thinking about this proximity in relation to the kind of modality of thought that might come through the prism of negative prehension. And this leads me then to an articulation of value that Brian will speak about in more detail, which is around an economy that Brian and I and SenseLab have been trying to develop, which has wanted to take really seriously this thinking of value into the realm of financial markets, because it's become clear to us that if you want to develop an ethic of value that is resistant to normative forms of valuation, resistant to whiteness and the colonial as a wider project of defining humanity and organizing certain bodies as participating in and excluding other bodies from it, that we also have to address this in relation to the most dominant form of value that we live with, which is capital. And so I think that what would be interesting would be to move then straight into Brian's account of the surplus value of life, which is what he'll be talking about. And then when we return, to then give you more information, if you're interested in it, in how we take this sort of philosophical project on neurotypicality, whiteness, and value, the account of what is often unheard in Marx and might and in the derivative markets of contemporary financial capital, and then introduce what we're trying to do with value in the project that we call the 3E process CPIC.
So I think I'll do the same thing Erin did, and instead of reading a formal piece, because it feels a bit odd with a small audience, I'll speak to it and see how far I get. And I wanted to develop one concept that is very closely allied to what Erin was just talking about, and I'll just start by repeating some phrases that came up in Erin's talk related to the infrathin. The potential of the more than, so a focus on excess. The quality of an experience or event coming into itself, so a focus on emergence or ontogenesis, the way things come to be. The inact of the occasion's own affirmation of its difference. The inact, so focus on the event, an affirmation of its difference. It's asserting its own singularity. The share of experience valued not for what it is, but how it affects what is coming to be. So something, a value that's located at the cusp of things coming into existence before they're fully determined as to what they will be. So a valuing of that movement from potential into an actual taking form. The value of what she called, following Whitehead, the negatively prehended, what is almost felt, or felt in the way it is excluded from explicitly being felt. What is not explicitly taken up, but is still stirring at the threshold, or at the limit, and modulates what takes place. The almost being, or what Lapoujade in a recent book would call minimal existences, or the least existences. Referring to what does not register, but nevertheless has value. So pointing to forms of registering that maybe take the result of an event, move it into another sphere, leaving behind this richness, the ontogenetic richness, the qualitative richness behind it. What courses through the just like this, the just so of the event. So our question that we both have worked on together and separately in our own ways is, how do we value this excess? And we worked on that question for many years in the context of the research creation group that we collaborate on, the Sense Lab, in the context of the production of knowledge at the crossroads of art and philosophy and politics, moving into and out of the university. So we worked on how we attune ourselves collectively to these minimal existences, to this infra-thin limit of things coming into themselves, and what we can draw from them, how it can move into the creation of new ideas, but especially new ideas understood as enveloping ways of action that indicate emergent modes of relation. So we were going along quite happily in that kind of project for a long time. And then we started being very concerned with the kinds of distortions that the academic environment and that functioning within a monetary economy based on grants within that environment brought to the work that we were constantly having to fight against. And we decided that after many years of working with grants that we would leave it behind and try to create an economy, a kind of microeconomy, following Marx's idea that capitalism grew out of the pores in feudalism, and that there are surely pores in neoliberal capitalism out of which we could start growing on tentatively, however small a scale, the seeds of what could potentially become a post-capitalist world. We were challenged by a group that is working on new digital technologies coming out of blockchain, post-blockchain technologies, who told us that if we're serious about value and the revaluation of value, we couldn't not look at how value works in the most advanced segments of the capitalist economy, which are the speculative markets and in particular derivatives. And that we have to study that and get out of some very traditional ingrained ways of looking at the economy. There's been a tendency on the left to dismiss speculative capital as in some way fictitious capital, as if it were illusory. It's getting harder and harder to maintain that now that that sector of the economy has become actually far greater in terms of its value, capitalist value, than the productive economy. It's taken a certain piloting role in ways that lift off from the productive economy, that try not to be held down by the gravity of that economy, but obviously can never take flight from it. But there are different modes of capitalist value that function at that level, which aren't taken into account either by the traditional notion of money in capitalist economy, which is taken up uncritically often by even alter-economic projects and was actually taken on wholesale by Bitcoin and the first blockchain types of projects. And also can't be reduced to labor value. Marx's notion that the value of something was the amount of labor congealed in it, he said. So in the traditional, uncritical, orthodox way of thinking about money, money is a medium of exchange, a unit of measure, and a store of value. And all of those functions revolve around a notion of equivalence. So money is what allows different things to be commensurated. And it equalizes, it allows us to equalize and compare values. That completely overlooks the idea, the self-evidence that capitalism itself actually is based on unequal exchange. In Marx's time, he talked about it as the extortion of labor value. But in our time, it's developed in very, very different ways. And part of what I'm asserting is that the center of gravity again has moved toward kinds of speculative movements where the relationship between input of labor and output of value are no longer in any way commensurate. So in the internet-based economy, once something is set free and moves through that economy, the amount of labor congealed in each instant of it is vanishingly small. It tends toward the limit of the infinitesimal almost. It tends to the thickness of a click on screen, so that the values are generated by how information flows, so that what's being created is a kind of surplus value, a flow rather than a labor value. Now that's very similar to the way in which derivatives function, because derivatives are ways of surfing and gaming the flows of capital and producing surplus value out of that circulation with a circulatory system of capital taking precedence over the conversion of investment capital into productive capital. So the financial markets work in this dimension of excess, and in a way that can no longer be reduced to either Marxist or orthodox capitalist notions of money. So that's sort of what I wanted to grapple with. And part of the proposition when the group we've been working with, which is called the Economic Space Agency, contacted us, their proposition was that even though Bitcoin had a libertarian basis and swallowed wholesale basically the orthodox definition of money, it allowed for a certain hacking or hijacking of finance. And that their proposition is that the left have to learn how to reinvent money. We took that further to say the left has to learn how to revalue value, with money being a secondary question in relation to that. So what I wanted to develop was this idea of the way in which capital, in its leading sector, actually works off of excess, look at the process of that, and construe it as a specific mode of a processual operation that is afoot in the world and allied to what Erin was talking about as that qualitative value of excess at the cusp of emergence. So saying not just turning away from capital, but saying that capital has appropriated certain processes that run in the world and could run in different directions if they were deviated from the path of capitalist appropriation, which is always putting a number on the qualitative, quantifying the qualitative in a way that constitutes a certain kind of apparatus of capture of life energies and appropriates that toward private property. So capture, quantification, capture, appropriation. Traditionally on the left, you have to sort of put a cross up to any kind of operation that you find in capital as if it were the devil. But if capital is an operation of capture, operating in a field actually larger than its own apparatuses of capture, and upon which those apparatuses of capture depend, then it's potentially possible to return to that field from which capital arises and which it captures, and extract movements from it that move in other directions, which can be valued otherwise. So the image of these from within the system, the image of these values comes up in what's called externalities. So an externality is something that affects the economic system from outside. They're often negative externalities like a war or a crisis, political crisis, which affectively jolts the system, and the lack of confidence and the fear causes a kind of panic or retraction, demonstrating that capital, which purports to be dedicated to use value, to utility, to functionality, is actually entirely bound up with, and in fact predicated upon, affective processes. That is constantly running after them, muting them, or magnifying and appropriating them. And when the ones that are magnified and appropriated belong to the positive externalities, and those are things that have to do with quality of life. So, for example, real estate around an attractive part of town with parks and good schools is more highly valued and has a higher price, but it's more highly valued for the quality of life, what it offers in terms qualitatively, and the price construes that qualitativeness, translates it into number, and then often there's a sort of a cascading effect where that quantification of increasing number pushes the market further, and it sort of goes off the rails, it goes off the hinges, and the prices rise astronomically. So there's sort of a runaway quantification process from this qualitative basis, which is essentially forgotten and then is normally destroyed by those movements because new kinds of investment and new kinds of investors move in. So that kind of runaway quantitative aspect is a tendency that's inherent in capitalism. And that's actually where surplus value in the capitalist sense lies. It's crucial to make a distinction between surplus value and profit. Profit is an amount of money taken over that comes in excess over the amount put in. But it's taken out and realized in money and then appropriated for private use or plugged back into the economy as investment money. But that's not what surplus value is. Surplus value is defined as the capacity of a quantity of capital to produce more capital in the future. Okay? So surplus value is actually the excess over any particular profit you can take out, on the assumption that you're going to be able to move that process further and keep quantifying more and more, creating higher and higher values so you can take out more process. Or at the limit, among the hyper-capitalists, it gets to such an absurd extreme that there's that in the billionaire class, they're basically running after surplus value for the sake of surplus value because they could never use or spend or even count the money that they have. So it becomes a self-perpetuating drive, and to the extent that people fall into that self-perpetuating drive, they are becoming figures of capital. Their desires, their person becomes a character of capital, a figure of capital, which I think is the case with Trump. So surplus value is this constant generation of excess based on the potential to generate profit. It's speculative in its very definition because it's a speculative expectation of more to come. The more to come happens at a time further down the road, so it encompasses an interval between the present and the future. So it's no longer looking backwards at the labor put into it, it's looking forward into the value that can be gotten from the circulation system, more and more in terms of surplus value of flow, turnover, constant turnover, than it is looking at its productive base. So the surplus value, capitalist surplus value, is this driving by the capitalist system and the taking up of the human bodies that populate it in this relentless, manic drive for greater and greater quantification, with the prize always at the next interval. So it sort of drives capital toward more and more accumulation, endless growth, which is, we all know, is no longer sustainable, and creates, through its own dynamic, creates more and more inequalities in the world. So that's not a very pretty sight. But if you go back to the kinds of things Erin was talking about, and these externalities that are qualitatively defined, you can sort of look at, you can sort of say that there's something that we could call a surplus value of life, which is directly qualitative and has that value of the just like thisness of the event valued for itself as its own experience, allied to the just coming into itself of events that will lead to takings form, new forms that emerge, that add something singular, new, not yet seen to the world. So, going back to that idea of positive externalities, there's that qualitative field is full of differentials. It's not just one, it's not a calculation, it's not just one image. It's, if you go into that neighborhood, there are all kinds of contrasts within it, contrasts between it and other neighborhoods, and it's in the contrast and the differential as it gives an overall qualitative feel or affective tone to the neighborhood that quality of life comes out. But those kinds of differentials are everywhere in what capital gives a quantitative definition to. If you think of what, sort of like in the derivatives, they're always hedging on differences in exchange rates between currencies, for example. That's a huge one. But what's behind differences in exchange rates between currencies? There's an infinity of differential conditions in national cultures as they play out internally and differentially between themselves, so that exchange rate is giving a single number to an open field of an infinity of factors differentially playing out. Okay. Capital doesn't care about the qualitative aspects of those and what it means for people's intensity of experience, richness of experience, or even often their survival. So I tried to develop the concept of surplus value of life, thinking in terms of qualitative fields, and of those fields being composed of differentials that were constantly shifting, that get summed up into a number, which is a way of them being captured into another system, because once they're summed up into a number, they go into the economic indexes, they go into the ledger books of corporations, they drive surplus value production. That can't just go on its own only on surplus value of flow. At certain points it has to go back into productive economy, so that goes back in ways that will then feed the surplus value of flow, which changes what things are done, what the kinds of investments are. And the earth is terraformed in relation to this need for the drive of surplus value, in the capitalist sense, running roughshod over those qualities of life and the differentials found ground level, which never disappear. So part of that idea is that there's a quantification machine that is a capture of qualities of life and a conversion of them toward forms that feed capitalist surplus value. But if capitalism is an apparatus of capture, which is a term that Deleuze and Guattari used for them starting in Anti-Oedipus, which was in a lot of ways almost a prophetic book because it was written in 1972, but it already almost feels like a definition of mature neoliberalism that we're living today, but it was before the fact. I just lost my train of thought. So if there's capital as an apparatus of capture, that means that what it captures isn't already included in its system. So you have to make this distinction. The capitalist system is a system of solidarity of certain kinds of operations that cohere and create financial systems of investment, banking systems, all the things we know. But those are part of the siphoning off apparatus, the apparatus of capture, and they depend. The proposition is that that system depends on siphoning off and converting another form of surplus value, which is surplus value of life, that exists in a field that is more expansive than the capitalist system itself. So instead of thinking of capital as a system or as a structure that we're inside, and thinking that if we're going to be outside, if we're going to move into a post-capitalist future, we somehow have to think our way to the complete outside of it, which is impossible. It's something that no one can really quite imagine yet. Or we step to the side and look at it as if we're outside, but we're inside it, and it is inside us because it has powerful subjectification powers that are creative of subjects and are forming of bodies and are terraforming of the earth. So the idea is that you can give it another vocabulary. Instead of talking just about system or structure, you can talk about system and process. And there are processual movements that have to do with emergence, with that limit, that cusp of coming to be, where tendencies are just stirring, and they're stirring differentially, but not yet in a mutually exclusive way. Not in a mutually exclusive way they will take on if later, when something takes form and carries one or a set of those tendencies into a very concrete configuration. So there's a field of potential where the potential is in excess of any particular iteration of what comes to pass in actual form. That's where surplus value of life starts. And where it expresses itself, as I explained in the example of the positive externalities, is in affective tonalities, global affective tonalities that are like the overall feeling of an event or an experience that we feel with an intensity that gives it a lived value for itself. So there's also surplus value with a certain kind of surplus value of movement with that, because as Erin was explaining, there's always more potential than is actualized. And that potential doesn't disappear. It remains as a reservoir of potential. And even if it was not taken up, if it was negatively prehended, it has left its trace. Its very exclusion modulates what happens. So it's sort of included, even in the case when it's excluded. So that potential rolls over, just like capital turns over. When something takes form, when an event reaches its culmination, when an experience culminates in an affective tone where you say, that was it. It was just like that. I felt that, and that was the liveness, the intensity of my life at that moment, and I value it for that. There's already an excess. You're already beyond that because a next event will be coming, and the potential will roll over into it. So the question of the proposition of the sense lab is, all along has been, are there techniques for that? Can we make perceptible that turnover? Can we magnify a bit what hasn't registered, give it value in our collective actions toward new emergences and new forms of collectivity. So I try to take advantage of this distinction between process and system, the idea of a processual field versus a systemic environment, because calling it an absolute outside or an immanent outside rather than a relative outside to the system. And then see if there's some way not only aesthetically moving that through art, at artistic or artfulness, as Erin would call it, at its conjunction with philosophical concept making, at its conjunction with the emergence of new relational forms that are ethical or political, at least emergently proto-political. So then the question that we got from this challenge to think financially was, can we actually make an economy out of that? Can we make a little pore of a microeconomy where we could start experimenting with surplus value of life? Is it possible to use numbers differently to index surplus value of life in a way that values it positively and preserves it and allows it to follow its own course rather than being captured into the capitalist course of things? So that's our sort of crazy proposal. It's basically saying that we value our lives moment by moment affectively through this feeling of the quality of those moments felt as values in themselves. We're convinced that though that feeling is always collective, even though a share of it comes to us as our feeling, our realization, our enjoyment, that's completely it's sort of an angle on that trans-individual field that's full of differentials and potentials, rather than the starting point. It's more like what precipitates from that field around our body in a way that we can take possession of, not to make a profit from it, but to move our lives forward, to re-enter relation with other people in a way that moves that process of qualitative advance, which is another word for creativity, or creative advance in Whitehead. Fully understanding the collective nature of that movement and valuing the collective forms that we find techniques for to move it forward. So our proposition, the crazy proposition, is to build an economy that runs on surplus value of life, basically an economy that takes what's implicit in capital, that it runs on externalities, that it runs on affect, and try to make that at the heart of the value system, basically making a value of affect in ways that could potentially actually be folded back in or back out toward the dominant economy in order to make the project of exploring this whole domain self-sustaining. So that's sort of the project in its largest expression, with none of the details that would give you a chance to understand what we're actually talking about. But I think I need to stop there.
Bien, bueno, tenemos un rato para poder hacer preguntas, comentarios. Yes, Gonzalo.
Well, first, thank you very much for one of you for your talk. To be honest, when I arrived here, I was very, very tired, but I really wake up when you talk. I will make some question more for clarification to be sure that I understand what you rightly. I I am not sure if in your idea of value, benefit play a role or not. If I understand you well, play a role, but a different role in the idea of economic value. In economic value, benefit is essential, but I have the impression that you use benefit, but difference from the economic idea of value. That's the first thing. And the second one is that in neoclassical economics and in classical economics, time play a crucial role. I don't know if you have thinking about a type of reconceptualization of time, because in capitalism it's idea of acceleration to rethink values. Also, I was wondering about the follow, because in some way you try to think a new economy, something like that, embedded, because the idea of the market is disembedded, to re-embed the economy. But how you can think about that without trying to go to the pre-modern time, you know, because in modernity, all the systems have a high level of differentiation. Is this implies some type of de-differentiation? And also, I was curious if your idea of super values of life have some connection or not with the same idea of Melinda Cooper, because
surplus life.
Oh yeah, surplus life. Because she used to criticize economy in a new stage, but also she tried to think about a new form of surplus life. And finally, just one comment.
Keep going. Yes. I remember.
I think classical and neoclassical economy has something very strong to propose for the academic world. Is that they can mathematicize their theory. This is crucial for the people in the faculty of economics in all the world, because it's very comfortable to work with mathematics and they have their own language and so on. And for that, it's crucial the use of money to make the mathematization. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll start at the last one.
I remember.
First, and then we maybe go back to the beginning. Yes, there's a mathematization in neoclassical economics. There's also a mathematization in the financial markets for derivatives, which is called the Black-Scholes equation. I don't understand maths, I don't understand all the details of it, but what I know is that it's it's based on probabilities, and it's trying to grasp volatility through probabilities. But probabilities they're fairly unwieldy tools because they never correspond to the particular case, right? So what they try to do is to calculate instantaneous volatility. So they take it to the sort of limit point of instantaneous volatility, but that's all based on a kind of mathematical fiction, as if time was a point that moved through. You know, it's sort of the anti-Bergsonian notion of time. It's a fiction. It's a total artifact, and they think that they can predict by trying to study the instantaneous volatility of one moment and then extrapolating it to the next. But in practice, they know they can't. So if you read traders, they're always talking about how there's almost this that they have to have a supplement of intuition in order to apply the equation to a particular trade. And when that happens, and what they're actually doing all the time is looking retrospectively from trades made. So it's still a retrospective study, not a prospective study. But that means that the trade is actually what they call making the market. There wasn't some underlying price attached to some instantaneous volatility. The price was made because it was made. And that makes the market, and the market readjusts itself around it. So it's this crazy emergent quantification of the market that just doesn't have the kind of descriptive value that neoclassical economics wanted to have for its mathematical formula. So all that is sort of just falls right into our hands because it's a complex, quasi-chaotic, uncertain system creating emergence effects that is what the market is actually doing or what it is as it moves forward, but then construing that somehow as a foundation. Right? So the quantification is in some ways a sleight of hand that becomes kind of helper to intuition rather than a descriptive, an effectively descriptive tool. We want to use something sort of similar. We want to be able to index qualitative movements, not because we think that the number might have descriptive power, but as an index in the sense that it's attached to movements and is in some way showing that there's a complexity underway that's actually doing something in terms of spinning off emergence effects. And so part of what we want to do is try to create a microeconomy that's part of a larger environment of microeconomies. That's part of this project, where each economy would have its own system of value. Ours would be surplus value of life, indexed to indexes of complexity and affective intensity. Others would have different ones. But in the manner of a derivative, which has different tranches and the value is the overall, which could have different natures and different volatilities and different qualities in the sense of predictability, that this field of economic spaces could have that diversity so that they might be valued for the outside, say the cryptocurrency market as a whole, but there's this diversity that's valued because it's a qualitative diversity where our value, which is completely incommunicable to the markets, could be incommunicable to an alternative post-capitalist looking commons-based, for example, project working in the same environment. So we're sort of sheltered from direct valuation by being appreciated and creating the confidence to however we can index ourselves to our system of value, contributing to this overall as like one tranche of the derivative, so that we're buffered from the outside economy. And then we want to create ways of working collectively that do not have individual shares, do not monetize internally to the system, but works on collective energies like we have always done through the sense lab. So that's sort of the overall picture, but then there are all these other questions.
Benefits?
Do you want to say something about your
No, you got yourself into Marx, you have time for questions.
The benefits, yes, we look at it as very different because it can't be reduced to self-interest and a rational calculation of self-interest, which most economists, or at least heterodox economists now, don't believe is possible anyway because of the chaotic nature of the economic environment and the velocity of the changes and the complexity of it, so that people are really sort of surfing complexity rather than rationally calculating outcomes. So that the self-interest in the capitalist domain has become more and more of a lure, more of an illusion, and that people are actually operating on a very different level where they're evaluating through their actions a field of potential that they can carry with them, construed as human capital, and that they're constantly sort of recomposing with that capital in order to surf the unpredictable waves of the economic system. So it's all done still in the name of self-interest and rational self-interest, but those kinds of calculations, which aren't really calculations, have to happen with affectively more than rationally, with the rational calculation as once again a kind of helper or leavener of a kind of intuition of these complex movements. So things have already moved onto that kind of affective basis. And what I've been trying to argue is that at that affective basis, we're completely open to the world, and the tendencies moving through us are jostling us in an immediacy with the outside, with the movements of images, with the movements of varying predictions which usually don't coincide with each other, with the uncertainty of what others are doing, with the uncertainty of what we ourselves might be able to do next. And that we're divided among ourselves by this churning of different potentials that we have to draw out of some single course of action at each moment. We have to resolve it into a vector. So that we're what Deleuze called individuals rather than individuals. And as individuals, we're affective resonation machines before we're rationally operating subjects. Not that the two can be separated from each other, but the balance of power is shifted. So if you look at it that way, then there's this kind of it's almost like you have to coincide with the interests of the events happening in the world rather than projecting your self-interest on them. And again, those are collective conditions, and in a sense you're facting yourself as an angle on the collectivity. You're operating as an individual and at the same time as a trans-individual. And then what's the interest in that? If the interest is quality of life, if the interest is intensity of experience, it's not finally quantifiable. It's not finally represented by your salary or your pension. It's really what you can do creatively with your life through the modes of relation with which you surf the volatilities. So we move. I try to move toward more notion of trans-individual desire than individual self-interest. There were other questions, lots of other questions. I can't remember what they were.
They'll come back. They'll come
Yeah.
circling through. Let's see.
You don't have a question?
Like also like in the same fashion that was a bit like throwing words and a semantic field, I guess, like to think about obsolescence in this context.
About
Obsolescence.
obsolescence, yeah.
Obsolescence.
Yeah, that's a useless question.
I don't know if you've read Bill Brown's has something in which he explained obsolescence is an invention that an American economist made in the 20s.
Yeah.
So it's like that you always need something newer, something brighter in a way. And also like ephemeral, because ephemeral is a word that is so used in the arts also, but it's also something that is about to die, you know? And it's very different in this word. Also like I understand what you mean by the quality of life, but you are warning us also about the dangers of capturing, and we always discuss about wellness, you know, health, all those words that usually people think that are captured by fashion,
Yeah.
in a way. So, and also the word index, that for me it's a mechanism of discrimination, as in the catalog. So I know the sense in which you are using it, you know, as an economic index, I guess. I don't understand really, but for me it's like.
Well, it's in dialogue with that. But you want to start with the first ones first?
No, but are you finished?
Yeah.
Yeah. Such good questions. Yeah, maybe I'll start with the indexicality because maybe I can connect. There's so much. Brian and I, so this project that we're actively not talking about that has you all confused about the economy, the reason we're not talking about it is we've never been able to talk about it and make any sense. We've tried.
Well, except in less than 3 days.
In less than 3 days. It's so complicated because you have to imagine that this proposition was made to us, to a group of people who have no background in economics 3 years ago. So if I were to define the Sense Hub, I would say that the Sense Hub is an emergent collective that takes challenges on. So when we got this, we took the challenge. We just read. We read and read and read and read and tried to understand.
And workshopped with radical economists.
Yeah,
or
but I was getting
professors.
there. But not actually, we didn't workshop with them
Not
yet.
in the beginning.
We read and read and read and read until we got to a place where we had an idea of what we couldn't live with. Or another way of putting it, what we wouldn't be able to compromise. Because what the Economic Space Agency were asking us is, do you not have the imagination to invent other ways of valuing? And honestly, it was painful because we're surrounded with people far on the left who, myself included, who had a history of being allergic to the question of financial capital. So it was like a rebuilding of a body around this question until there was a moment where a bunch of us went to Silicon Valley. And we said, we dream of this alter university that we've been trying to create called the Three Ecologies Institute. And we really do dream of creating a way that we could practice other ways of living. Not to say for 1 second that we're the only people doing this. In fact, from our experience, there are thousands of groups doing this. And we learn from each other. And it's not about creating something in the absence of the things being created, but rather creating other networks of experience and value. And Brian and I spoke of, in a kind of anguish about how we were at the limit of our imagination. We didn't understand how this was possible, but we needed help. And what happened is that the economists came to us and they said, you don't actually need our help, because if we knew how to do this, we would have done it. But we'll help you translate what you're imagining into enough of an economic vocabulary that together we might be able to push beyond where the derivative market has taken us.
And where the crypto market
and where the crypto market was taken. And what they taught us was this account that Brian talked about. It says, if you're interested in looking at it, the trader's name is Eliyash. He was a trader in the French stock exchange.
In French, yeah. And there's also another American named Robert Wozniacki.
Who was on the New York Stock Exchange.
Who was on the New York Stock Exchange.
And both Robert and Eliyash say that in a quite lengthy experience trading, like over a decade, each of them, that the equation, the mathematical equation, the Black-Scholes equation, was a farce. Because the speed at which the trade had to be made could in no way account for the
complexity of everything happening around it.
With the equation. So in fact, that the equation was always done after the fact. And so both of them began to develop theories of time in the market that they felt were in some kind of connection to the philosophical lineages that we come from. So there was this kind of strange conversation that began to happen. And so I'm telling you all of this because we, the economic proposition that we're coding, literally, as we speak, which is called the 3D Process Seed Bank, struggled for about 1.5 years with the question of measure. Because no matter how much you engage with the question of process, if you're looking at an economy, even within an internal crypto-economic world that the Economic Space Agency is imagining, that Brian briefly described, so a whole bunch of economic spaces that would interrelate. So you could think about this as a kind of global or non-local way of thinking about what a lot of local alter economies already do, where you might have a village with a lot of people exchanging, the bread for the babysitting for the whatever. But here you have a global, because it's digital economy doing this, that at some point we would need to measure, because you can't exchange without measure. And
within our economy, there's no exchange. It's
Right.
a radically non-exchange based way of working, but the exchange happens at the boundary. So we wanted to do that to preserve a radically non-capitalist mechanism within it.
so it was a long time until suddenly it became clear to us that it was an index we needed and not a measure. And here the index is really coming from Charles Sanders Peirce and his alternative semiotics. So it isn't operating, it's operating as an indexicality. And what we were trying to think was, instead of saying, so very, very simply, and I'll come back to obsolescence, but very simply, if you say, okay, in my work week, I have, say, 80% of the activities in my work week in the university are organized to waste my life. Maybe that's fair. For example, in my university, every time we do anything in relation to a student, we have to go onto a digital system that loads very slowly. And so I have to put in one thing and then wait for the whole fucking thing to load so I can put in another thing so that it can then get sent to another administrator who waits for the whole thing to load. And we're actively wasting our lives, all of us. Because somewhere along this process, somebody's going to do it wrong, probably often me, which is going to send it to the wrong person who's going to wait for it to load and so on. But in the midst of all of that, I might encounter a student in the hallway, and they might tell me about a new idea they have, and all day I might carry this idea with me. And it's very, very difficult to separate the use value of my life from that kind of speculative proposition, which I've also carried with me through that. How do you measure that? How do you talk about that? And so the indexicality is a mechanism to begin to talk about the coloring of the event. That like maybe the day was colored by a quality of curiosity, but there's no way in the economic valuation that I live in the matrix of the university system, to speak about that coloration, except in terms of, actually, I can give you an example of something that bothers me. Often it'll be talked about in terms of emotional labor.
Emotional what?
Labor. And I think, no, you can't steal my color. This moment with the student, it made all the difference. I don't want that to be called labor. I really don't. I want it to be called joy, maybe. And so as we've been growing this economy, we've had hundreds of conversations about how do you value that which is not quantitatively important, that might take just a second, or it might be a look, or it might be, but it alters the condition of existence. How do you value that? And what we've come to is the concept of indexicality in that way.
Yeah.
And I want to say more on obsolescence, but maybe you want to say more on indexicality.
Yeah, well, for indexicality, as Erin said, it goes back to Peirce, and we're trying to sort of make double use of the word, bringing it back to Peirce, but also bringing it into an economic vocabulary. So one of those operations of translation into the economic that Erin was talking about. So indexicality, the basic example of the index is smoke to fire. So an index is an effect that comes from a dynamic process, and the fact that it's there indicates that a dynamic process happened, but it doesn't tell a whole lot about it. Who set the fire, how big it is, what it's doing, right? So there's a certain indexicality for a person, every sign, and that what it is the effect of, he calls it the dynamical object, and he says the object of the sign is never expressed by the sign. And people forget this part of his theory of the sign, that there is this inability to capture the conditions of emergence that have to do with this indexical dimension of the sign. And what we're saying is, maybe we can figure out how to get smoke out of an idea that colored the day, right? And if that moves into, say, back into the sense lab, into experimentation, that creates a technique that can be used as a technique of relation to generate other encounters with other colorations that can be maybe shared with other people who can take it in their own directions. There is a kind of production of value taking place on that emergent qualitative level. So if we can figure out what kind of smoke can be attached to that, then we're indexing it. But it can also say, well, we can say to the other economic spaces in our little environment, this is our index. This is the index of the value we produce. It's immaterial value. You're not going to be, we might produce books and a lot of other objects, but that's not what we're talking about. You're not going to see it except indirectly. But the fact that we're able to continue and people are interested and the techniques are coming out and they're going places, you can see something is happening. We have a dynamical object, and that's what the value is. It's an immaterial value.
And just so, I think that, that's really, this is obviously a conversation I'd like to continue, but the question of the ephemeral and the obsolescent is really important there, I think, because the reason I began with negative prehension is to signal a logic that is very, very different from the logic of lack. So the logic of lack, what is lack in Portuguese? La falta, yeah. Is very, very well known through the work of psychoanalysis. Right? So
or in economics, the notion of scarcity.
Or of scarcity, right? And really all of Whitehead would go against it. Because Whitehead's philosophy, like all of process philosophy, or you could go all the way back to Spinoza, are philosophies that are interested in what is carried in excess of itself in the world. And so they're theories of desire that produce rather than withhold. And that's the main difference between, for those of you who were here the other day, between psychoanalysis and schizoanalysis. That psychoanalysis, broadly speaking, is a theory that regresses into experience to find what was missing, and schizoanalysis is a practice that follows the seeds of a process. One of the ways that Guattari talks about this in his own work is in an account in a psychiatrist's office where he was with a patient and another psychiatrist, where there was a patient suffering from a paranoid experience, and the psychiatrist was saying to the patient, "But tell me about your parents." But the patient was looking out the window, and Guattari talks about how what was needed was to go for a walk. It was clearly what was happening outside the window that was pulling a body, not what's happening inside the room. And so the question of obsolescence for me would be very different from the question of ephemerality in that way, right? Because you could say that the ephemeral carries that negative prehension in the sense of that which cannot yet be valued and yet persists the quality of the air or the quality of the tiredness for those of you who've worked all day.
It persists as a potential. Once it emerges, it's
Yeah.
always in the world as
Right.
as a potential that could come back. That's the nature of qualities.
And I mean, we could go on and on about where that takes us. I'm not that interested in developing one camp against another. I'm actually a trained psychoanalyst, so I could also give you lots of good reasons to think about psychoanalysis. So that's not the point so much as to say that if we go back to other ways of thinking values, so we've spent a lot of time on the question of capital, but if we go back, for example, to think about questions of race. What I learned from Black studies is that those theories of obsolescence have already, they've already become obsolete. Like, Black folks have already been excluded from the concept of the human. So those theories of lack are already what have produced their invisibility. And so all of those, the writings, the contemporary writings of the Black radical tradition are very critical of those modes of thought, and tend to move instead into asking, in a different vocabulary, certainly from what I'm asking right here, but asking the question of negative prehension. So what is it about our existence that makes it so impossible for whiteness to recognize, right? What is that? And so for me, the question ultimately is, in the work that I'm proposing, and definitely in the work that Brian's proposing, none of these thoughts can have any kind of purchase on the world if we don't develop practices for them. So we could develop the smartest economy in the world, and I promise you our economy is not going to be that. It's going to be very weird and very, very preliminary. But it may give you one or two ways to practice other ways of experiencing value. And if it can do that, then maybe the question of the pre-established forms of value that have become so second nature that we've assumed them to be true might shift. And with that, maybe then the question of how we, and I think I can speak quite generally, cannot imagine anything but these forms of value, can be shifted. And then the question of obsolescence, or the question of desire as it plays out, that I'm also completely consumed by, in reality, can shift. And that's the question I think that we're asking.
Yeah, what Erin was describing, for a long time we've been investigating this concept that we call the anarchive. And the question was, if you're thinking in terms of events first, rather than objects, there a lot, and then you think of the documentation, say, of an art event. The documentation of an art event always leaves the sense of the liveness of it and the intensity of it out. It loses it. So the question of the anarchive is, are there ways of registering traces that aren't meant to describe or encapsulate an event, to register it as happening in the past, but are traces that are active in the sense of being reactivatable, that there's something that might lure another event that has a certain artfulness in it to come next. So it's a way of passing along down the series of events what was not immediately valued in the first one. So the anarchive is a way of pushing surplus value of life down the line of events. And we've worked for years on how this is possible. How do you anarchive? And the anarchive will have to be totally central to our economy, because that's actually where the value is going to be being produced.
Yeah,
And following that anarchiving.
creation.
Sorry?
Avoiding iteration.
Yeah.
Iteration, avoiding repetition, but iterating with variations, a difference in repetition process. So the notion of obsolescence thinks of an object, or even if it's like a digital system, you're thinking of it as a thing you buy, and it has a use. And then the use becomes obsolete because another object or system comes that you think works better, but more and more it's really less about use and functionality, it's about desirability. And it's often about what that object offers to your life in terms of how you are presenting your life to the outside in terms of a certain kind of prestige value. But the idea is that something behind it is still that there's something that's used, and the use becomes obsolete and you move on to something else. That doesn't apply to events. Ephemerality applies to events. And in the ephemeral, there's like a stream of events happening in series, iterating with variation, and across that stream, certain potentials are carried. The potentials never die. They're what Whitehead calls eternal objects. Because once a potential, always a potential. Right? And that's what we're talking about. So it does have to do with ephemerality, but not in the sense of not in the sense that it can be connected to obsolescence. The other thing I wanted to say is that in terms of quality of life, it's a terrible, terrible word.
About that.
It's because it's completely co-opted by neoliberal capitalism. So in order for this to make sense and to be possible, there has to be a lot of thinking done on what constitutes quality. What's the relationship between quality and quantity? What kinds of composite or in-between states between the two exist, such as intensive magnitude, intensive quantity? What's the difference between an extensive quantity and an intensive quantity? Where does affect fall in all of this? Affect just isn't how we feel ineffably. In Spinoza, affect is a very, very particular, singular way, in the shape of an encounter. What is it? What are we talking about when we talk about intensity? What does it mean to index intensity? So there has to be a really extensive rethinking of all of those categories that I find the beginnings. I find the so the directions for in process philosophy, in Peirce, in Whitehead, in Bergson, and Deleuze. There's a huge philosophical work that has to happen, and I don't think that can be separated from the work that has to happen on the economic level. So Erin has an essay called Cephalopod Dreams, which talks about our project and develops the ideas of quality from the point of view of the collective operations of the kind of microeconomic society we would want to be fostering with our. It's not directly economic in that sense, but it's micro society of relation of the kind that we would want to foster. In my book 99 Theses for the Revaluation of Value, I have a lot on just trying to work through affect and intensity, intensive magnitude, and all of that. I'm still working on the concept of intensity and going back over the concepts of intensive magnitude. It's sort of one of those times that Erin was talking about where we're thinking just at the limit or just even beyond the limit of what we can think, and there's so many things that come up that I'm still worrying over it and working it, and we'll be publishing more on it. But also at the end of the book I have a description of what the principles behind our economic project are that links back into what Erin talks about in her essay. So it's hard to convey it in a short time. It's hard to convey it without actually working together on it. But if you're interested in looking more, those two places would be good places to go. Both of them are available for free online. Cephalopod Dreams is on the Sense Lab site, senselab.ca, under 3 ecologies. And 99 Theses is in book form, but you can also, at University of Minnesota Press, you can read it online for free. And if you, in this service they have called Manifold. So you can get them for free, or we're happy to send PDFs as well.
Can I ask you a question? Well, thank you for this talk. It's intense, and it has differential simplicities. It's a little more graspable than others. I want to go back to Erin and then come back to you, Brian. Go back to what Fred Moulton wrote to you, his revision of your work, about all black being life is neurodiversal. And it got me thinking between this distinction regarding white, as white as being what's the word? Dominant, hegemonic, okay, and then black as its opposite, right? So I'm wondering, I would like to know your inputs on what happens at the level of, the opposites, right? And you're thinking black as difference, right? As the other, marginalized other. It could be, maybe in this situated historical context, it could be blacks. And I know this is not only the biological racial, but it also includes it. So it could be like women, it could be indigenous people, minorities, right? And my question is if it maybe to find a form of contesting whiteness, creating a concept that goes beyond those distinctions, that recognizes the historical, marginalization of minorities, but at the same time maybe goes beyond this. I don't know. I'm speaking out loud. That's one thing. And then, this thing about imagination came up, and then you said it, and it kind of makes sense. Like, I've heard you guys speak about doing the impossible, or imagining some world that we have a very hard time trying to imagine, forcing rational thought, to its limits, and have its limits in that liminal state, which I think could go back to the question of imagination, creativity in that sense. Lost my battery. And then I just wanted to ask Brian about the this economic proposal. Just wondering if you inscribe this, right, this within the grid of measuring, even if it's measuring those differentials, those intensities, doesn't the act of measuring include materiality, you could call it, that will push also what you guys are trying to create? I don't know if it's clear, but it's because still, if you're able to, let's say, register, it's not capture, register, and then you can enable this measure to not to reproduce, but to enact another potency. Isn't that process still haunted by the fact that there's a process of there's still a caption process, even if it's not our usual capitalist, caption and objectification process?
Yep. Yes, there is. Boy, those are hard questions. Okay. I'll say a few words about the second and then the first, and then you come back to the second. I think the biggest mistake we could make would be to imagine that what we're trying to imagine is pure. I think that what we're trying to imagine is how is it possible that I spent most of my life thinking that finance was neutral? And I think it's true that I did. Like I somehow believed that the bank was taking care of things, right? And that, you know, as long as I recycled and did the things that were, you know, the things that I knew were the right things to do, that I was somehow outside of the regime of valuing capital as it is. And I mean, I wasn't quite that naive, but almost. And what I found doing this work is that many of us, or maybe even most of us, are in positions where we have a feeling that it's so impossible to attend to the system of global capital that we'll just dismiss it and go on. It's like we push it over here and then go on with our lives and imagine that we're not complicit in those processes. And so I think that the work of the economy is as much about making us awake to our complicity in the system. And to ask, for example, I'll give you a very concrete example, that in my life, in my university life, it's expected of me to raise money. So at this point in Canadian academia, you don't get to have an academic career if you didn't receive grants. And so all of us spend months every year or two writing grants that have a return that is about, well, far less than 10%, let's say. And yet we don't really talk to each other. We talk to each other about how much we hate doing it, of course, but we don't really talk about how it's a terrible return, just economically speaking. Like how many other things we could do to raise that same amount of money that would take fewer hours, less energy. And if you add to that, you know, those Thursday committees that you go to, all of the work that upholds that very stupid way, actually, of making money, right? So doing the work on the economy started to make us more awake about the ways in which I've been socialized to understand what my time is worth, right? And that by itself was worth it, because then I began to realize that I had internalized all kinds of ideas about value, that somehow it was okay for me to take what most excites me, dumb it down into a vocabulary for people who hate to read them, because I've been on those committees. I hate reading those grants as much as I hate writing them, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just using that as an example so it got us thinking a lot about, okay, what if that's like a 300-hour proposition to write one of those grants for a less than 10% return, what else might we want to do with those 300 hours? And what if we actually committed to doing something else with those 300 hours? What would that look like? What kind of world would be possible then? And so what we're proposing is has all kinds of complicities. We don't actually think you can walk out of capital. We recognize that capital's main form of practice is capture. But recently, this is the last thing I'll say something else and then come back, but recently I was in a talk, well, I was in the audience, and there was a hip-hop artist from Los Angeles, and he got all kinds of questions about cultural appropriation. Or we were together, and finally he said, listen, hip-hop is faster than cultural appropriation. It's just like there are always people in our neighborhoods making it up again. So if you think that your cultural appropriation can eat up our hip-hop, you're just wrong. So we're sort of thinking in those terms. Yeah, it'll get captured, but what if each step along the way 3 of us, 7 of us, 12 of us, 15 of us got smarter about those 300 hours that we're wasting writing those grants and imagined another way of living. And that's really the proposition. Because to be truthful, I don't think that what we'll launch in a year will work. It's too complicated. But what it might do is begin a different kind of conversation. And that's what we're really hoping will happen. And in the meantime, so I'll just hold that because I know Brian has a lot to say about that, but I think your other question is so important, and I can't do it justice because that's why I wrote a whole book. But what I can say is that it's a very similar question, that if I hadn't done all the work I've done on neurodiversity, I would not have questioned as deeply as I do the category of the human. And what I know is that we have a category that excludes enormous numbers of people in the world. That indigenous folks aren't considered human. That black folks aren't considered human. That most disabled folks aren't considered human. And it's not actually that long that women have been considered human. And so if we really take that, and you know, in a lot of parts of the world they're not. I mean, men are deciding on our reproductive justice. What the fuck? So you know, it isn't the moment for a universal gesture. I'm not saying that that's what you're suggesting, but it isn't the moment, I don't think yet, for us to say, you know, we need a moment where we actively speak about whiteness, I think. We really need like 2 or 3 generations where we constantly remember that what allows us to speak and to make sense is whiteness. And once we've done that, once we've restated again and again and again the colonialism that is in our gestures, we will, I think, have habituated bodies to other ways of living, including our own. And so I have a very, very strong intuition that the conversation that I can contribute to is that one. And that comes in part from my black and indigenous colleagues who are really, really tired of white folks not talking about whiteness. They don't want white people to be talking about blackness. They're doing that work. There's reams of work on blackness. But that work is not doing its work if it's not counteracted by us actively recognizing the ways in which we pursue those forms of what I would call neurotypicality.
When you say not talking about whiteness, it's not analyzing the forms of subjectivity.
Yeah, it's that systemic work. Yeah.
Well, it's systemic. It's
systemic.
It's less the form of
so,
subjectivity than the forms that create subjective effects that are very, very similar and operate in the same way.
Yeah. So you know, I have an enormous prestige as a white person. I feel it all the time, and I don't mean my skin just. I really don't mean just my skin, although it helps. For sure, it helps get across borders, etc. But I mean the ways in which I can present just now, the ways in which I can claim the knowledge, the ways in which it might feel that people from the north bring something of use to the south, right? I mean, this is a colonial act by itself. And I think that what distinguishes whiteness is that it never names that. And so really what I'm trying to think is, what if we named it again and again, not to reduce it, but to recognize it and then to build other practices. And that's the work. But I'm not saying enough, like it's really a big project, because what I've noticed, and I can't speak for Chile at all, but what I noticed in Brazil was that the conversation about race in Brazil is still very epidermal. And this conversation I'm trying to have is not really epidermal. It's really from a logic, which is and this is coming from black scholars who are saying that what makes for an epidermal blackness, like Fred Moten says, that you know black lives because they're dead. So what cops do, what police do, is they name blackness by killing it. And what they're trying to do, these scholars, is articulate a logic that is before the police got their hands on it, which is a kind of politics, a kind of sociality, a kind of life. And that's what Fred means when he says black life is neurodiverse life. That black life is not actually captured within the limits of that value system of neurotypicality because it was never included in it to begin with. And so if we want to learn about value, black life might be a really good place to begin. Or if we want to learn about value, indigenous life might be a good place to begin, which doesn't mean that there aren't black people who have incorporated whiteness or that there aren't, et cetera. So that's the logic that I'm trying to articulate.
Yeah, within that logic, it's really important not to construe black and white as opposites.
Yeah.
It's not that structural coupling of opposites and then a devaluation of one side of the structure. That's whiteness. Blackness in that sense is included in whiteness. So the distinction is much closer to what Erin was talking about when she's talking about the hip hop artist who wasn't worried about cultural appropriation. He was really funny about it. He showed us these hilarious videos on YouTube of young white people doing hip hop, and they had appropriated it. They'd taken it into their system. They were trying to get a certain prestige or even profit from it by moving it into a white sphere where it was no longer threatening. Because what happens in inner Los Angeles can be very threatening to the white world. So they were sort of taking it and whitening it and making it and commodifying itself in one way or another. Clearly, it was not going to last. Those hip-hop moves will be obsolete in a month, right? But not because it has this movement that goes through it, but because it can't keep moving in that innovative way. So it's going to have to go back and steal something else from black culture. But in the meantime, even though it's been appropriated, on the other side, it continues. It continues with this amazing generation of innovative vocal and physical forms. And that innovation, black people can commercialize it and have, but to that extent they're participating in the system of whiteness. But even then, within the black community, it continues. And it's this creation out of this ferment in the culture, bringing itself to expression on the same plane as the culture, immanent to the culture. It's an immanent coming to expression that carries this excess of potential with it that means it's always turning over into new forms. And just that every popular form of music in the West has come out of that black culture. So blackness isn't the opposite of white. Blackness is a different mode of relation, a different aesthetic that's completely bound up with a sociality, what Munton calls the aesthetics of black sociality. And it's not epidermally defined if you think of it in that way. So going back to the question of measure, when a hip hop form arises and then becomes part of it sort of draws attention, draws energies, starts to create new forms, stands out as a form that came from that culture. If you think of it aside from the captures that will inevitably take it up, it's still resonating within that culture, on the plane of that culture. It's an accentuation of some of the movements of that culture as they enter new combinations and create emergent effects. The emergence of the effect, the fact that you can then say it's a form, means that it's a differentiation, an accentuation and differentiation at the same time. Because it differentiates and can be a form, then it can be captured. But it wouldn't be able to create the next effects if it, in that field of immanence, if it didn't also differentiate to some degree. So I think of that as an affective process properly. That accentuation, differentiation is how affect works. Whereas that capture, instead of being an accentuation differentiation, is a separation connection. It connects in order to separate, and then it puts it in totally different circuits that don't have the vivacity, the vitality of where it came from. So it's a kind of degradation of the vital value of it, and that's mediated by quantification, by profits, by all kinds of forms of encapsulating that emergent effect as a form that can be given conventional value. So I think in terms of accentuation, differentiation, and separation, connection. And on the side of, so our proposal is, well, why can't we play with that duplicity, with that doubleness? Internally to our economy, we're going to be operating through our anarchiving, through our techniques of relation, on a level of accentuation, differentiation. But we do have to sustain ourselves. The people who work with us have to eat. We have to buy materials. We need a space to work in. We have to, and to that extent, we need to participate in the dominant cash economy. So, but if we create a certain membrane around our operations, where we're experimenting more and more and more on how to operate on the level of accentuation, differentiation, anarchiving, the forwarding of processual potential into new takings forms, new emergent forms, without ever monetizing or measuring inside in the usual sense, but having some way of registering that folds back in, creates feedback in the system so that the emergence effects can have their own effects. Then we're operating on an the level of affect and intensity internally. But to do that, you cannot measure, you cannot separate, you cannot monetize, you can't have individual shares, you can't have authorities that are attached to individuals as actors with self-interest. You have to operate as what Guattari called the group subject. But then, if we're part of this ecology of economic spaces, we can do a certain kind of separation connection to that sphere by indexing it, creating confidence that indexing is actually showing that a creative process is going. We're going to call it a creative process engine, our economy. And then we can say, well, we have certain mechanisms for saying we've created a certain amount of value. We call that our currency. We call it O-currency because it's an event. It's a derivative of the events that we're organizing. We're going to trade you our currencies for your currency, whatever it is, however you have minted it, however you construe its value. And we're going to set up an exchange system between us where we work collaboratively and as much as possible on a mutual aid basis. But then to the outside world, another separation connection happens because there will be a cryptocurrency that can operate on the market that indexes all of that. And then that allows us to go step by step from our affective operating to translating it into currency to sustain what we're doing and creating feedback loops for the dominant economy back in. So that's the idea. Whether it's possible is a whole other question. But if it's possible, it requires a lot of economic thinking. It requires mathematical knowledge that we don't know yet, don't have yet. And it requires...
Not for lack of trying to bulldoze mathematiicians to collaborate with us. We
need qualitative mathematics that can help us with that kind of indexing. But it needs people to take seriously that we can band together and create ecosystems of alter economic processes that are all working differently, but working together under the aegis of the commons rather than private profit. And it requires imagination, it requires speculative leaps, but we actually can't speculate beyond the limit of where we can think, right? So we're on that limit. The only way to get further is to do something at that limit that gives us a little platform to take the next step. So we have to start doing it, we have to start building it. And so all the theorizing we're doing is oriented toward actually starting to program it. prototyping some of the things we want to see in that system even before the programming comes in the way we do things with the tools we have now that we use for collaboration online. So we want to try to seed even what we're doing right now with ways of thinking and doing that prefigure what the economy will be like, and will suggest ways of coding operations differently. So it's an enormous project because it really creates, it involves creating a completely different basis for how a digital platform can work.
And the last thing I'll say is that it's being coded by a team of women who are neurodiverse. So also at the level of the coding, we're really trying to challenge the male-dominated coding world that tends to take the code as a given rather than questioning its own allegiances to capital and to its, to military forms of research, etc. So it's been a sort of an infinite black hole of trying to do that, but processes will come. The coding's been going on for about 2 years already, so things are growing, but it's not not easy. And I think that the thing I'd leave you with is that one of the things that stays with me is that the most common platform financial platform that we're familiar with is Facebook. And I often think about how Facebook monopolizes our time, mine included. I spend a lot of time going down those Facebook things. And I think, like many people, that I do that because I have really smart friends, and my smart friends post smart things, and I enjoy reading them. But I often wonder what it would look like if we could actually believe with our smart friends that we could navigate something else. And so we're not trying to build an alternative to Facebook, obviously. I mean, we don't have the skills
one of the projects we're working with is doing exactly that, Holochain.
Yeah, but it is sort of at that level that you think, okay, every time you put a like on Facebook, you're monetizing. You're it's simple. And what if we didn't do that? I mean, what if we imagined that our efforts could be used differently than that? And that's really what we're trying to do.
Well, another group we're working with called Holochain is trying to create a peer-to-peer system that would completely bypass Facebook,
peer-to-peer,
and Google, and they will be replicating some of those platforms, but without the monetization and without the gathering of information, in a completely peer-to-peer spirit. And they have their own very interesting economic conception to what they're doing. So there are a lot of these projects happening in new cooperative forms, new alliances between cooperatives that operate in a cryptocurrency, through common cryptocurrency. This whole area is exploding. There's crypto communists working in Berlin trying to figure out what to do from a communist perspective. It's a whole area. When we hear about crypto economics. Okay.
People are really tired.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much.